Takia, can we have a roll call?
Sure thing. Good evening, everyone. I have Andrew Hare,
Present.
Benjamin Mednick,
Here.
Eileen Leahy. You're here. You're on mute.
I'm here.
Jeffrey Duran,
Here.
Lawrence Harris Jr.,
Here.
Minor Carter, Paul Rankin,
Present.
Robert Tufts,
Here.
Ron Schneider.
Here.
Okay. Roll call is complete.
Thank you. Are there any comments from the minutes of the meeting on May 18th?
Move their passage.
Do I have a second? Do I have a second?
Yeah, I second it.
So
I have Mr. Mednick for a second. Who moved it?
Paul Rankin.
Okay, thank you.
okay, we are up to, in the agenda, public testimony and comments. I'd like to, at a later point in time in this meeting, talk about at least an issue that the executive committee discussed in terms of public comments. But I believe we do not have any public, nobody scheduled for this particular meeting for public comments. Is that correct?
Yeah. There was nothing on the CRC email, so.
Okay, fair enough. So we'll move on then. Committee reports, 2 committees, and then we'll get into the general discussion on the charter review comments. Number one is the number 1 committee report would be the executive committee. Eileen has sent out minutes on the 30th of May that capture the last executive committee that we have. And just to highlight, and to give her a little bit of relief, to highlight what is in her report, please do read it. We talked about in the executive committee, the meeting that we had with the mayor the week earlier. We had an update on our outreach efforts, which we'll go into in a moment. We covered each of the working groups. One of the questions I'd like to raise now is that it seems that the working groups are now successfully at least updating our Google Drive. Is it fair to assume that all members of the commission actually have access and know how to get those reports from the Google Drive? Do we have any issues? Hearing none, I will assume that we're in good shape getting those reports. And we also ended the executive committee by talking about the prospect of meeting in person at some point in time in the future. But we've learned, actually, I think it was from Takia, who had inquired further, that we will have to stay with virtual meetings for probably the length of this commission. Wow. So our efforts to try to have a cocktail at the boatyard or a cool beverage has been thwarted. So we will meet virtually.
If I could ask a few questions on that or clarify.
Sure.
If we were to meet in person, either in our smaller groups or during outreach, is there any type of quorum issue for non-scheduled meetings if we meet in person?
I mean, I'll address that. We've talked about it before. You can't have more than 4.
Regardless of the format or forum in which we're engaged.
I'll let Takia speak to that, but that's my understanding.
So if you guys are meeting and there are more 4 of you, that's considered a quorum. Okay. If you're speaking about business.
Okay.
So if you guys meet and it's just to meet at Boatyard.
Yeah. We're okay.
and you're not speaking on business, then you're fine. But if you have business matters in front of you, then yeah, it can't be more than 4.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, I think one of the things I heard from Ben, at least what threw me off in the question, was the non-scheduled meetings. So I guess it's more, Ben, it deals with content. If we're just having a non-scheduled meeting, then we're okay. And we don't discuss. We actually don't review any commission matters. Eileen, is there anything you'd like to add on that executive committee? Again, I just tried to give you a little bit of a break in terms of.
Yeah, that pretty much sums it up. I think one of the most striking things I'd like to mention on our discussion with the mayor was our talking about amending the charter versus restructuring the charter. And his comment was, well, how can we do that? How can we restructure? And I think that really hit me in terms of that meeting. We did discuss it at the executive committee.
Mm-hmm.
So pretty much just that. I am going to try to get back to putting I've posted all of the reports that I have on the Google Drive. I haven't been able to consolidate them, and hopefully we'll get them done. So the pieces are all there. I'd like to put it all together so that we can look at everything under each heading, and hopefully we'll get that done by the weekend.
Good.
You need any help with that, Eileen?
No, I actually just need to sit down and cut and paste everything, but thank you. Yeah, I've been up to my eyeballs with elections today and just didn't get to it. So.
I ask a question, Andy,
Please.
about the mayor's comment about restructuring. I mean, we've spoken about this, so I'm sort of asking a leading question. But basically, I mean, even though it might be a good idea in his mind, and it might even be a good idea in Mr. Lyle's mind, I'll talk about that later, to do a restructuring. What the answer is, no, we're not restructuring it. We're making amendments to it because to do a restructuring would take so much time.
Mm-hmm.
Is that kind of the outcome?
Yes, it's an interesting point. I was actually going to get to that when we talked about outreach, because I was going to try to touch on not only the matrix that, if I can use that word, the matrix that Eileen has put together in terms of outreach of key people, but I was also going to cover, maybe we'll do that when we get to that in this meeting, but cover specifically what I took away from the meeting with the mayor. I thought it was quite a productive meeting, but Paul, I think you raise a very interesting point, because that was probably, if not the first, it was the second point he raised. And it was just a wide open meeting, like, what's on your mind? And clearly that was on his mind.
Well, I mean, I just like to while we may not be restructuring in this commission, I don't think it's unheard of for that to be our main recommendation.
Right.
And
exactly.
if we do that, that really takes away from the need to be getting into some of this nitty gritty and legislation and putting things into ordinances and resolutions. So it's just a thought. It was interesting to hear from him that he was open to that concept, and we've heard about that from a number of different places. So as we move forward, I think we need to think about that. Could that be the overreaching recommendation? And then each area has special recommendations. So it speaks to how we want to present the report.
That's spot on. I totally agree with you. And you and I were at that meeting. I think it was just striking that he gravitated on the point that this thing needs an overhaul. And we, by the way, corrected, Eileen, correct me if I'm wrong, but we corrected his notion that that's not the role of this commission. We're not going to give him a restructured charter. We're not going to rewrite it for him. But he returned to the point and wanted to know resources required and how long would it take. And he obviously it was on his mind. I mean, it was just something that he was interested in.
And he very much wanted to hear from us what resources and why we were making the recommendations we were making. And
Right.
that kind of goes back to when we've been talking about providing research and citations for what we're doing.
Let's, I'm going to just, I'll try to highlight, Ben,
I have a further question on that.
sure.
When we first started, we briefly talked about comparable charters in the state of Maryland.
Mhm.
I don't think we pursued that too much. And I raised the point of Annapolis may be slightly special because of its historic nature. Is there any thought at this point, now that the idea of restructuring has been floated, to incorporate that type of side-by-side comparison during this commission? And if so, would we bring in outside help, someone that might be able to compare side by side our charter with, some model for a restructured charter, a more modern charter, a more streamlined charter? Should we incorporate that type of outreach?
Well, my view is that we don't have enough runway left in this particular project to do that. I would personally, and this is now a personal view, I would love to do that. I think that would be a terrific, I just don't think between now and the 2 milestones we have, mid-July and mid-September, we can actually do it. And I've dug into the finances, Teresa Sutherland suggestions, and I'm going to get to that point too. She really goes into almost a total rewrite. And I was talking to Jeff earlier today, and to me, it's like a brand new wallpaper on the wall, but you forgot to check whether the wall was okay. You forgot to check whether, everything was okay behind it. And you might get a wallpaper that you like, but you also might get a wallpaper you don't. But we can, and I think we should tonight, really get into a little bit more substance on this. But if you'll allow me, I think let's go into the outreach section. We'll just talk about essentially the matrix that Eileen has been collecting and putting together and distributing, because I think it's going after trying to design and making sure that each one of us gets involved with one of our key stakeholders. I think there's also an element that we ought to consider, and that is that we also want to reach out to community groups. Now, we've already done that with parole, but I think, my take, and quite frankly, I thought it was a very successful, I'd love to hear what Lawrence has to say, but I thought it was a very successful engagement that we really did seem to, at least from my point of view, energize and gain some interest in the community groups. So we really have two things in my mind. Number one is the stakeholders that would be the mayor and the city manager and various aspects of who runs the city. And then we have the community. And I tend to think we ought to be really working hard to make sure we get to both. And I see the first one is getting quite organized right now because of what Eileen has tried to put together, who's doing what with whom. Whereas the second one, I think we're keeping our fingers crossed and hoping that there will be some momentum or some traction that we can actually go out and talk to some community groups. With that, Eileen, do you want to add anything in terms of the information you've been collecting on at least the stakeholder side? And I know that's a word I just made up now, but on the key stakeholders that we're trying to outreach into the city government.
I don't specifically. I don't know, Paula, do you want to address it under the outreach committee?
Yeah, that might be better.
Are you just talking about the community groups? That's the only
Yeah,
one.
the community groups and the sign-up sheets that have been going out and the next steps.
Yeah, if you'd like, we can just quickly talk about it because there's not a lot to talk about today. I mean, should I go ahead and make that quick report? Is that what you want me to do, Andy?
Yes, if you would.
Okay, Jeff and Rob, you okay with me just making a quick comment on that? So Eileen was kind enough to put together, and it was a lot of work, I think, to put together a list of I don't even know, actually 15, maybe a few more, a few less, community groups plus contacts, emails, phone, etc., that we could reach out to. This is including Lawrence's group, but others as well, Eastport Civic and other key associations that she was able to identify. So much appreciation for that, Eileen. That's great. I just sent that out maybe 2 days ago, if I'm then, to our little group, which is going to have to take a look at it. We have not met on that. But I think the point here is to do exactly what Eileen and you guys are already doing with the key stakeholders, individual stakeholders, and to sort of divvy it up and to begin to make a direct contact with these groups. Jeff, Robert, you want anything else to add?
Oh, no, I think that you summed it up well.
But if I understand, you will send that out and we will volunteer to sign up.
Yeah, we're going to copy Eileen's approach.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, what I tried to do is to look at a lot of what the city had on file was really just homeowner associations. And so I tried to get some diversity, both geographical, homes versus apartments versus public housing, so that there's a mix. And so there's 2 in each ward. And then I try to come up with some community leaders. For instance, Ward 5 has kind of been identified as an area that has a higher concentration of Hispanics. So there is a Hispanic liaison that I think would be, we need to be talking to. And just try to get them. There may not be a whole lot since some of them are home associations, but like, for instance, the Housing Authority of Annapolis has a newsletter, which might be helpful. And that goes to all of the public housing areas under that purview. So that's where I was coming from with putting that together. And the only other thing I'd mention is on the sign up for all of the aldermen and everything like that, everybody's been great to get back to me. And I did just put an update before the meeting. So pretty much everybody's covered, at least with one person. And again, maybe when the subcommittee meets, if you all have specific talking points or areas, just to hit on, that might be helpful, just so that we're kind of hitting some of the main points as we go out. And I guess we need if you all in the subcommittee could flush that out about who's going to be contacting who and how you want that to proceed, that would be helpful.
I'll promise for all of us, we'll do this ASAP, but we haven't so far. We'll get that out. And anybody, by the way, once that goes out, you'll see what's not there. And so Ben or others who might have an idea about who to add, just add it. And I'll do what Eileen is doing, which is just expand the list, open it up. And if we can set up meetings, bang, let's do it. I will say one thing. The meeting that I had with Eastport Civic Association a couple of weeks ago, was not good in my mind. Not because Eastport Civic Association isn't good, they're fabulous, but because I think Andy's idea of getting it down to a manageable size, like get a couple of people from the association to talk. The chairperson of the association, maybe, and one other person, because I think, Andy, you're right in your approach, which is speaking to a group is great. We have to do it and ought to do it, but boy, oh boy, is it better to get a couple of people, the leadership, to talk directly to you. I think so. That's the hard part, and we have to make a real effort to do that. I think. So I'm going back to Eastport, and I welcome help.
In terms of outreach, and this is more of a broad question to everyone, are there any names that are missing? Are there any interest groups that are missing? And I don't mean specific community associations, but is there anybody that, when you look at the ideas and the names that we put together over the last week or so, is there anybody omitted? And the one that came to mind is from the 2011 Review Commission. Didn't they talk to the head of the Municipal League, the Maryland Municipal League?
They talked to somebody there.
Are we doing the same? Or have we done that? No. Would there be value in doing it?
Put it on the list.
Okay, okay, let me,
I mean, it could even be assessed with doing a presentation or talking with the whole group also.
Mhm.
And if you're looking at going back to Ben's suggestion about looking at side-by-side charters,
That's kind of what I was thinking.
I still think, and I'm speaking for myself personally, I can use some more education on this whole charter business. I mean, I think Mike's presentation last week was really helpful, and Jacqueline and Taki are great resources, but I think as we move forward and as we get more questions, I'd like to hear from a professional, to be honest.
yeah.
I seem to recall at one of our earlier meetings, and it might have been Minor, who said they had a relationship with the municipal league and could get us connected there. I could be wrong, but I know we had a short conversation about that probably 3-4 meetings ago.
It was minor.
I think you're right. You're right.
I
Why
don't
don't
think it would be
I,
difficult to just make a phone call. I mean, I have to talk to Minor anyway about something. I'll ask him, but I think you could just make a
Okay.
call.
well, that was the only name or the only organization that kind of jumped out at me. Rob?
If we're talking about like interest organizations, I think it might be interesting to include groups like the Spa Creek Conservancy. I know they're active in the city. There used to be a Back Creek Conservancy. I don't know how active they are right now. Those are kind of the two major sorts of Annapolis specific kind of environmental groups that I think would be worthwhile to maybe try to reach out to and include.
Do we have any way of getting access to them? Do we know who's running them or who is leading them?
For Back Creek, I do not. For Spa Creek, they have a website. I've reached out to them before for a couple of issues. So I'll add them to the list, Paul and Eileen.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, Amy Clements is the head of the Spa Creek
Exactly.
Conservancy. She's a Ward 1 resident, and I could give her a call if you wanted, but maybe check it out. And I think too, as we reach out to these groups too, if we can't get meetings or, we're running out of time, if we can ask about newsletters and things like that to at least get the information out, because people do read newsletters and sometimes feel comfortable writing an email. Just a thought.
For environmental, you might also include former Alderman Littman,
Mhm.
Ward 5. He's an environmental engineer. He owns Ace Hardware on Forest, and environment was sort of his purview when he was on the council.
And do we know how to reach him, Ben?
I'm friends with him. I could reach out.
But that would be good. Yeah, I think actually all three of these ideas are very strong, because one of the things that Ron and I ding dong a little bit on was the whole issue of the preamble, what we are going to talk about philosophically, and things like the environment are going to be an important thing. So it'd be good to actually get what their views are on what the charter should or should not be. Well, maybe not so much what it should not be, but what it should be, what it could do. So I think all three ideas are strong. Moving forward on we're still on outreach. This is where actually I was going to mention a little bit about, or at least go into a fair amount of detail on our meeting with the mayor on the 24th of May. My takeaway was it was a good meeting. We met with him for about an hour, a little bit short of an hour. I took some handwritten notes, and then Eileen also took some handwritten notes, and she elevated her notes to what got distributed. This afternoon, I revisited my handwritten notes, and this is what talking and writing delivers. One of the things he did say, he said checks and balances are required, but interestingly, I thought he did see his job as not strong enough. In other words, he did not have enough power to get his job done effectively. Now, Paul has just distributed his thoughts from Mike Lyles, which is exactly the opposite of what Mike Lyles thinks about the power, if you will, between the mayor and the council. So what's fascinating about this is it's almost like the old saying, where you stand is where you sit. And so, maybe they're seeing each of their roles differently, but one of the things I think is absolutely important is this is going to be crucial. And I'm more talking to Ron right now in when we start looking at the powers section, which is section 3 of the charter, because this is the driver. I mean, this is really the bedrock of how you develop a good governance model, trying to figure out, who does what when, and how can you amend, and how can you modify, and how can you withdraw. It's the whole issue of how does the clock work. And so I think, that was an interesting point that I thought he made. He also went on, again, these are my handwritten notes that I was, he felt there were too many layers. And actually, if I can just extend that one bit, Eileen did chime in right there by saying that's something that is on her mind too. So I think he was looking at kind of the complexity that sits within just getting things done.
And that gets touched on in terms of looking at Article 4 and Article 5.
Yeah,
So,
right.
And I'll go over that. I've done a little more research since the last meeting.
And then we've already covered, and we can go into more detail if you want, but we've already covered in this meeting the issue of the rewrite versus the revision. And I didn't mean to put it last in this. It's only that he brought it up. And if I remember correctly, correct me if I'm wrong on this, Eileen, but if I remember correctly, I think he brought it up twice. I think he brought it up at the beginning of the meeting, and he brought it up a little later on. But I may be a little soft on that because we may have brought it up the second time.
Yeah, I think we actually brought it up the first time, and he kind of
brought it up the first time, right?
Well, no, I think we brought it up the first time, but he was a little surprised by the question. And you had also asked him, did you see any obstacles to going in that direction? And so I think he brought it up again because he had a little chance to think about it.
Mhm.
I came away with the impression that he really hadn't thought about a restructuring and understanding. I think he was aware of some of the things like archaic and obsolete language and things like that, but the concept of really just taking it on, and he was interested in how would you go about that? Would you have a separate commission? Would you get, we talked a little bit about it, but not really much, but the idea of, really having a group sit down with consultants with a group bigger, not bigger than what we are, but with different representation. And we did also talk about the challenges of inclusivity and diversity. And, this commission was used as an example in terms of how do we get the city more involved? How do we make our charter more inclusive and more diverse? And he seemed to be very interested in that. As he even said, he goes, well, I've never been accused of not liking change. So I think he would be supportive if we went in that direction.
And Ben, I don't know whether we've closed a circle for you, because I think you raised a very good point in terms of how specifically we should view our task over the next, 2.5 months. It's my concern is that we don't have the resources in terms of the overall bandwidth, nor do we have the time to really go into a lot of detail. So, but we do have the opportunity, and I think we will have the audience to hopefully forcefully present a case of why things should be changed, or even how it should be changed. Now, what exactly the language is, I think that's might be a little bit beyond us right now. We just don't think we've got. I don't know if you have further thoughts, Ben. And I was really trying to.
Yeah, I would just say that, let's pretend that you get to a place where there's a recommendation for restructuring. But because of time limits and circumstance, there's no real work performed on what restructuring means. My concern would be that the recommendation provide a framework, guidance, starting point as to what restructuring should be about and what authorities, whether that's municipal league or some type of comparable analysis, led us to make that recommendation. I wouldn't just want to leave it as a very generalized statement of recommendation number one, the charter should be restructured. I mean, it should at least have bones on it. And to that point, secondary, but I think it's akin to this concern, as we go out with our outreach, we talked, I think, in the last 2 meetings about having a common platform of questions, which is similar to that, what are the bones here that we are leaving behind? And we don't have that yet either, but I think if there's a commonality of questions, and I think if there's a commonality of feedback, we could at least leave these recommendations behind with a little guidance, if you will, if not straitjacket, That's all. I understand the time constraint, Andy. I agree with you on that.
Any further comments?
Yeah, I would just say in the executive committee notes that I put out is more specifics about our meeting. So if you're looking for it, that's where it is.
I urge you to read those. 2 other things in terms of outreach. We did meet with the Greater Parole Community Group. Lawrence, do you want to add anything, any feedback? And by the way, we are not giving you up. Your lead was trying to say you're not going to be given to us, but no, you're given.
Okay. Well, thank you. First of all, I want to thank you, Andy, and Paul for supporting our meeting. You were very fortunate in that this was the meeting that we have each month where the entire community is invited. We do have an executive team, which is about 9 or 10 people. We meet about 2 other days during the month. But to the one point about inclusion, there was one member of the community who asked about HACA. Are we visiting that as we go about our business of revising or providing information toward the revising of the charter? I thought that was a good question, one that just kind of came out of nowhere.
Right. Yeah, I thought that was because it did come out of nowhere. I personally was not ready for it. It was a tough question.
So yeah, that was good. And the other point I want to just revert back to the earlier conversation about various stakeholders. We do have a very vibrant community association within our midst. We call them our neighbors, and that is the Fairfax Road Community Association. This is a group of probably about 100. It's one street, a dead-end street between Forest Drive and Harris Allen Boulevard that not many of you know about. You just drive past it every day on your way to Chinkopin and other places. But there are approximately 100 or less homes there, but they are extremely active. And Alderwoman Rhonda Pintel Charles has made it her point to keep them involved in a lot of the issues related to the city because of where they're located.
Good. Thank you.
I'll get your point of contact. I don't have it handy, and then I'll forward it to you guys later.
Thank you. The final thing on outreach, Paul, would you give us just a quick shot, because you spoke with Mike Lyles, and as I mentioned in my email back to you, he's already spoken to the entire group of us, but I felt it kind of cemented some of his earlier comments, because clearly this is what is now on his mind, which I always think is important to understand.
Sure. I'll go over it fairly quickly. I did write a memorandum up this afternoon. Minor was to be with me on that call, but was unable to make it. So I regret that because, you know, he has a wealth of experience and knowledge that probably would have made it an even better call. But quickly, there are 5 points of substance that Mr. Lyles brought up during our conversation. And I hasten to say, as he did, that you know, these are not the official views of the city. This is a conversation with the city attorney, not vetted. So first, he talked about the ease with which charter amendments can be undertaken now by the city council. And he thought that he, by the way, was also a city councilman in Bowie and has had experience in DC politics as well. So he comes with an interesting background, other than the fact that he's a constitutional lawyer. So his sense was that you know, the idea that this 5-4 vote could lead to a change in a charter raises the question of why there's a charter commission every 10 years. And he said that with a smile, but it frankly is a very interesting point because that is the fact. And I don't know whether others are aware of it, but I think I'd asked the question of him, could a charter amendment be voted through 5-4 to get rid of the mayor? And the answer is yes. And so that's the looseness of it all. And so his suggestion was that this group consider looking at that provision or those provisions and perhaps tightening it up a little bit so that it's more difficult to make changes either or impossible to make changes. He's aware of certain city charters around the state that have the council is not able to make changes except through commissions like this and recommendations made thereby. So that was one I thought very interesting. The second was the power of officers, as I phrase it. He said that right now we're in a hybrid form of government here. His view is that the mayor has substantial authority, massive authority actually, and sits on the city council. So his experience around the state here again is that there are other forms of government that are less mayor-centric. And by the way, he noted that these are neither good nor bad. He's not making a characterization of the way the city operates, but he said that's something that this group might want to look at. We also talked about lines of authority with the city staff. I pointed out that it wasn't clear in the charter who he worked for specifically. It looked like it was the mayor. He said that's true, but they also work obviously and daily and directly with city council members, but that's not clear in the charter. Again, he said you might want to take a look at that issue. He also pointed out that the city manager does not here have the authority to sign contracts, which is interesting. Again, a sort of an issue of lines of authority here, you know, who's running the show and how much power does any individual have. Again, no specific recommendation. And lastly, he talked about something I thought was very interesting, which was this issue of rulemaking. His point of view is that the city has plenty of rules, but there's no authority in the charter for a rulemaking process. And so everything has to be done, all rules, in quotes, have to be made by code revision, which leads to some silly stuff or things left out. And in the memo, you'll see he raised this issue of if you want to get a table on a sidewalk in front of your restaurant, you can do that. And there's actually a small provision for it in the city code, but the rule itself is the piece of paper that you have to sign, which is nowhere to be found, nor is there any oversight in it, except in the agency that you're working with. So
did he mention enforcement? Because that's also another thing that usually comes up with rulemaking, the lack of enforcement.
Well, he did not mention enforcement, but he mentioned lack of oversight. So he said there's a sort of de facto rulemaking process in the city. Again, it's worked. I mean, the city's doing okay, but it's not clear that the charter, clearly the charter does not stipulate how that process should work. So that was that conversation. It was really interesting. He said he'd be happy to meet again any old time. He was really forthcoming and generous with his time. So, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Any comments? Again, the meeting itself, Paul did a good job of spelling it out, and it's available on the Google Drive. Given the hour, if no other comments on outreach, maybe we can get into the specific discussions of where we stand with the respective groups looking at the various sections or articles of the charter. I guess this would, if we do Article 1 first, it would go to you, Ron, in terms of general provisions. Anything you'd like to report?
No, I mean, just on the preamble, I provided my thoughts on amending the preamble and a kind of an addendum to that. I had a short conversation with Ellie Tierney on Wednesday. She has coffee, once a couple times a month, with just in the general notion of kind of what kind of city do we want to be, and perhaps we should state that in the preamble. So I've provided those comments for that portion of the charter.
Okay, good. As I have taken a swag also but I didn't do it in terms of prose or text as much as in terms of thoughts. And I was trying to break it down, and I'd like to work with you on getting that further refined. And I know Ben had some, this is X number of meetings ago. I'm getting foggy in terms of what X, the value of X is. It was some time ago. I think we talked about, visions that you had in terms of, what this should be. But I'd very much like to, before the next meeting, to at least have discussions with what Ron has done, that the preamble portion, and maybe share with you the greater ideas and the thoughts that I've put together, and maybe we'll have something that we can present in our next meeting. Or at least when I say present, I mean I'm very interested in comments in terms of, are we on track? Does this fully represent what we'd like to have in this particular section?
Well, I think the three of us could meet at Boatyard without a quorum.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. And we can bring Jeff. Jeff will get us a nice, cool
I'm
beverage.
in. I'll buy it.
Okay. But go on to Article 2, Rob and Paul on elections.
There's also general provisions. You want to keep that, is that in with preamble?
Sure.
Were there any other comments for that?
Any comments on general provisions? Hearing none, I guess we'll move on to Article 2. But before we do that, as I'm peeling the layers of this onion back more, and maybe this is an unnecessary comment, I'm realizing about the complexity of this document, as opposed to it being kind of a rambling, almost silly document. I'm realizing, how spread out it is, and almost incohesive it is. It's frustrating for me. So I'm getting a little concerned that 4 weeks from now or 6 weeks from now, we're going to start to say, if we push over here, we need to do 5 things over there. And I'm not talking about detail. I'm just talking about just the way this whole thing is structured. I'm starting to get a little troubled so I don't know. I know Ben's brought this up several times in the past. And again, I'm not trying to put words into your mouth, Ben, but I feel that, as I'm digging deeper into this, those are the kind of concerns that are being raised.
Again, I sympathize and I totally hear the concern. I mean, the clock is ticking. I mean, I think that's a big part of it. But if we could agree on the commission's structural approach, versus the commission's obligation to review the structure of the charter. I think we can resolve this. And
Okay.
some of the components that I've discussed, I think could form part of that structure. For instance, bringing in someone from the municipal, like Minor had suggested at the beginning, and doing a side-by-side session, right? This could lead the commission to put together the bones of a framework by which, whoever's going to carry the ball after us would have to abide, if you will. And it's the same concept with these preambles that I originally mentioned to you, Andy.
Mm-hmm.
They're not so much to define, I mean, with all due respect, Ron, to, define the city that we want to be, which I don't disagree with. In my mind, the preamble could be the guiding language per section, per article, that whoever's going to carry the ball after us follows. I think that's very deliverable, but to put that type of guidance together in our recommendations is going to require much more interaction with these community groups, I think, because we want those bullet pointed structural recommendations to reflect, the city, not necessarily just this commission and its members. But again, I see how to get there without having to dig into the weeds, but I know it's hard to describe, and it's going to take a lot of outreach at this point to get it done. But I think you could do it.
I agree with you, Ben. I feel like we're starting to spin our wheels a little bit. I think we need more structure. I mean, how many times are we going to say we're going to do a preamble? I think we're at the stage where, does everybody agree we're going to do a preamble? Are we going to do it for each section? What's the decision? We have to start making some decisions, I think. So if you are going to make the decision that there's going to be a preamble for each section, the next step is who's going to write them and how is that, what's that process? Or it may be that the group says, well, no, we think we just need one overriding one. But I feel like we're talking about, we need this, but it goes back even to what the mayor was saying. How do we do this? So what's our next step as far as putting our words and our thoughts into actual writing and action?
In my opinion, it starts with putting a time frame around the community outreach and the stakeholder questions. I think we say, here's the 5 to 10 questions that we're going to commonly ask. We'll break up into the groups over the next 2 to 3 weeks. We get it done. We get to work and start filling in these questions. And then based on that, I hope we would have enough of a matrix, as you said earlier, Andy, to answer that question, Eileen, and put in our own opinions at that point, right? Because we've got the opinions of a wider audience and we can start to put that together.
Okay.
I think the answer is we need to start talking to stakeholders.
Mm-hmm.
With questions, though.
With
So,
questions.
which
Right.
we do not have. So why don't we just figure out right now who's going to write those questions? I'd be happy to help.
I was gonna say, maybe it should be for the outreach, since we're kind of organizing some of that. Would the group be okay with that? We can
Thanks,
knock
bye-bye.
out some of these questions and bring them back to the group as a whole.
I think that's fine. I would strongly recommend that. Let me get to you, Rob, actually to the outreach committee. Let me get to you at least the personal questions, personal because I wrote them, of before I went to see the mayor. This is what I wanted to cover. These are what I felt they're not specific. They're very, very high level, but in terms of just trying to provoke him, just trying to get really what is on his mind.
Well, let me push, if I could. I apologize.
No, go ahead, Paul.
I'm very sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, please.
I want to push on this because I think Eileen's point is right and Ben's point is right. But we got to get it done. So let's just get it done. So I mean, everybody's got to submit. Ben, are you talking about specific questions? You know, are we permitted to cross the street on Tuesdays? Yes or no? Is that what you're talking about? Or if not, what are you talking about?
Well, I think we've got the framework of those questions based on the 4 or 5 meetings we've had. I think I don't want to propose the questions. I don't want to drive this, but for instance, a question around vision, a question around the type of city we would like to be, a question around responsiveness. Is the charter even in the minds of community organizations, for instance? And does it empower the city to be responsive to their community needs? A question on structure. Is the city structured in a way that it meets fill in the blank, a community's need, a council member's need, a mayor's needs? I had to laugh a little when I was listening, Paul, to your meeting with Attorney Lyle. He seems to want a weak mayor who cannot be removed. You know, is that what the people want? And I think the way you ask the people that question is do you feel that fill in the blank is responsive? Whether that's the city council, the mayor, the directors of the offices, city services, et cetera. So I think the questions that you guys should formulate, we've actually already asked ourselves. They're general questions. And so I'm very open to pushback because they're not going to get into the weeds. We're not asking people, can you cross the street at 8 a.m. in the morning? You know, that's not what I'm proposing. And if the commission wants to continue going into the weeds, then my approach doesn't address that. But if it's about vision, if it's about structure, and if it's about restructuring, then I think we have the basic questions. We just need to put the right words in it and then get consistent queries out there so that we can compare the responses, apples to apples.
Just a quick response because we're on TV and folks do watch this. Mr. Lyles certainly didn't say that.
No, I understand that.
Okay.
I understand that.
All right.
But my point there is we're going to need a wider net of responses. Otherwise, it's very hard to interpret the answers that we get. And we want consistent responses to consistent questions. Mm-hmm. So the comparison is apples to apples. That's what I'm trying to describe there.
So, if I may, I don't think many people in the city of Annapolis either know what the charter is or actually care what the charter says.
I agree.
They have no opinion about that. So maybe the question is, what is the city not doing that it should be doing? And what can the city do differently? Because, you know, community groups, you know, I can go talk to Murray Hill and other people and about the city charter. They have no concept of what the city charter is. You know, so maybe you know, we can talk about fixing the size of bread, which I've said every time, but maybe that's down in the weeds, and we just need to kind of step up a level and say, you know, what's not working and what's working, and then that would inform us.
I think it's a great question.
I think that by asking that question, we're not going to get any consistent responses because everybody's going to have their own opinion, and we're going to have a whole bunch of good feedback that ultimately will not guide us. I personally think that what we're discussing here, and I don't want to be the Debbie Downer, but I think the questions might have to be a little tighter. Otherwise, we're going to get everything in the kitchen sink. I mean, I can imagine talking to a very well-educated citizen of our city, and he or she will give me 15 pages of revisions like Teresa Sutherland did. And that's not a bad thing. But at the same time, it's going to be all over the place. So if we embark on this mission, which I've already stepped up to, I caution, or I want us to think about everything that's going to come back and it's going to hit us between the eyes. It's going to be all over the place. Like for me, again, my little windmill is I want a balanced budget and I want that in the charter. And I think that's a very straightforward binary question. If I were to say, hey, we have a finances article in the charter. Let me explain to you what the charter is. Spend the time doing that. And here are the 5 points that we're focused on. And I have to do that for each section. That's going to take us a long time.
I also think there's a different set of questions as we talk with aldermen and directors, such as the finance director and the planning director. You know, a different approach.
But one of the questions that was on my mind, and I asked the mayor this question, as you remember, Eileen, right in the very beginning, was explain, or can you share, what are the barriers to getting your job done? And in terms of, you know, how and this is a little bit driving to Ben's point about responsiveness, but it's really trying to get him to say, does a charter make a difference to him? And if it does, where are the problems, or where does it work? But, you know, I do think that we have to keep, you know, if these are almost like, you know, guideposts on the side of the highway, you know, I think if you get very specific, or worse yet, if you ask what's the city not doing that it could do, you're going to get an incredibly long list of which is not terribly helpful, but a long list of things that people want, and that just, quite frankly, might be unrealistic to get. But if at the same time, if you're trying to focus more, and you don't I don't think you have to explain what the charter is. I met, you know, as Ron said, I asked 90 people or 100 people, and I'll bet you 90 people won't have a clue that there's a charter, or what its purpose is, or what its makeup is. But the point is that I think that these ought to be at least a nice enough marker on the topic, that whatever the response is that we get back, then as we try to assimilate all those responses, it makes some sense. Because I think if we just get this long laundry list of what's the city not doing that it ought to be doing, it's going to mean nothing to us. And we'll have done a lot of work, and we will have wasted an opportunity, which I think is unfortunate. Any other, at least comments before we, not so much close this off, but I think what we need to do is have a very specific deliverable in a very short period of time, because this outreach is happening. It's going to start very, very soon. And I think, you know, we ought to have at least something in the hands of each of us that we can take into each of these meetings. But any further comments?
Well, so are you handing it to the outreach committee?
Yes, if we could.
So I'll call a meeting. We'll get started.
Okay.
I'd appreciate anybody sending to us their you know, a fully formed question, good, bad, or indifferent.
Okay.
And we'll cobble together something and get it out to the group for comment, and just read.
Very good point. I think this ought to be a free flow of ideas, and I don't mean that we just dump on this committee, but just a free flow of ideas. These are the kinds of things, and then let you guys sift through it, and then from that come up with the 5 or 6, 7 things.
I took notes as people were talking, so I think, you know, people raised a lot of good, you know, starting points for these questions and things of that nature. So I think, you know, we definitely have a good start here with what people were talking about. So
I know I should know the answer to this question, but when is our next outreach with the stakeholders? Is it early next week, or is it sooner than that?
Well, I had a question on that. It's a little unclear to me who's reaching out to the stakeholders now that we've divvied it up. Are we individually supposed to do that, or is someone going to reach out on behalf of us?
I'd assume that each pair or single was going to reach out directly.
Exactly. So I guess your point, Ben, is we don't know. We don't know when the date is. I was just trying to tie a kind of a deadline, if you will, that we ought to have all this stuff cleaned up and then distributed. But so we're not quite sure when the next meeting will be. Am I accurate with that, Eileen?
I mean, Andy, I mean, what we've got is people have signed up.
Yeah,
So I
right.
think the question is do the individual people contact, like, for instance, does Ron contact Ally Tierney? So if the answer is yes, then he can go ahead and do that.
Yes.
You're also, I think, asking for a deadline. So are you saying that by the next meeting, we would like everybody to have met with who they've signed up with?
No, two different things. Really what I was saying, the answer to your first question is yes, the individuals or the pairs should do the scheduling because you all know your schedules the best. So the individuals actually find a way to get in touch and then get on people's calendars. The second part of the question is not so much when the feedback takes place, but these questions, these markers, these 6 or 7 things that Rob said he had taken notes and then we're just going to dump more stuff on the 3 of you and then you'll cull it out and then maybe from that we'll have the 5 or 6 good questions. Are we on the same page on this? Are we all okay?
Well, I can just say that I would like to have the group questions, the commission questions before I spoke with the stakeholder. I'm
Absolutely.
very happy if we all go in with our own bailiwicks, if you will. I mean, I don't have an issue with that, but I don't want that to be the driver of any outreach that we do. I'd rather go in with 5 or 6 questions that the commission has established are universal to this commission's work product, and then add additional questions as it goes along, whether from you guys individually or that I come up with. So I would like those questions in hand. And that to me means now, this weekend, if I'm going to reach out starting on Monday.
Sure. Is that okay? Okay. Do you think we could?
We shall meet. So
Good.
fire the questions to us.
Okay. So moved. Even though we didn't have a motion.
Okay, and do you want a deadline for us all to say, this is when we get all of these people contacted, and if we can't get it beyond that date, then maybe we won't follow up with them, or are we going to continue this? Again, I'm just thinking of that July 15th
Yes. I think
work session.
my take is it is now the beginning of June. We're a little bit past the beginning of June. I would hope we could get this done in June. So schedules being with there. And I also think, maybe I'm speaking more for myself, I think once we hit July and August, we're going to really hit scheduling problems. Just people are away and it's just going to be different or more difficult. So if we can.
Yeah, I think I agree, Andy. I think we should create a sense of urgency. I mean, in my mind, if we can get that first set of outreach meetings scheduled for next week, that should be our goal. By the end of next week, we've knocked out as many as possible. Assuming that we have the questions on Monday morning.
Okay, any more comments on this? Are we agreed to?
And then the next process would be, what do we do with all those answers? Do you want everybody to write up the notes, and would you like me to consolidate the notes?
I think it's incumbent on the individual or the pair of people to actually write notes and then send them. I don't think they need to be consolidated, but send them on to you.
Okay.
I'm not sure exactly what they're going to look like, what the notes are going to look like. But if we have a consistent set of, and I hate to use the word questions as much as a consistent set of markers, a consistent set of thoughts, then hopefully we'll at least have something that we can start paging through and have a pretty good understanding of this is what's on everybody's mind or collectively on. And I think this is more to Ben's point of when we get to the end of this process, that we have something that's usable and we can start to see either a trend or we can see some divergence of thought, or we actually might see new thoughts. You all okay?
Yeah,
Yeah.
one last question to Ben's earlier point, which I thought was a good one on if we move in the, just, I'm paraphrasing, if we move in the direction of making a recommendation, not necessarily the only recommendation, but a recommendation that a wholesale rewrite of the charter is would be a beneficial thing for the city, as he said, you know, we got to put some meat on that, right, Ben?
To provide rails.
Yeah, so you know, that I think may be a parallel process, and maybe we should have, I'm not even sure where I'm going with this exactly, but that to me is something that we're gonna have to reach out to, probably to the Maryland Municipal League and maybe the National League of Cities, and say, hey, you know, can you help us here, and then have someone actually help us for free. But that to me would be sort of a parallel process that might extend a little further than several weeks.
And I got to think that both of those organizations right now already have a PowerPoint presentation on best practices. And essentially that's what the rails would be, is, you know, our understanding, debate, and then adoption of what we consider best practices to be for the recommendation.
They don't. I've checked, at least Maryland Municipal League doesn't, but I will reach out to them because there's 170, you know, different charters in the state. So, and they don't, best practices is what works for you. And I'm not being facetious. So they have some general junk that is interesting, but it is really, really broad. I think we probably need the head of the municipal league to come in and say, okay, I've looked at your charter. Here's some thoughts, you know, based on the fact that he knows everything about every charter probably in the entire state, or she, I don't even know who it is.
Yeah, that's a shame, but even that discussion, if someone were to come in and have a working session with us on analyzing the charter, would be helpful, I think.
All right, why don't you and I play with that?
Sure. Is Minor not available?
He may be. He seems to be having some difficulties, you know, making the meetings and stuff right now.
Okay.
I'm just beginning to wonder about the question again, thinking about timeline. Are we just throwing this out there? Do we want to think about really sitting down, you know, and doing like a half-day session and knock some of this out? You know, it's hard to do it in an hour. We're now at an hour and 10 minutes in the evening, you know, with many people after work. So it's just a thought to maybe as we move forward, do not a big retreat or anything, but really just sit down and spend 4 hours and just knock it out. So
Boatyard.
A bar, absolutely a bar with a television set up. I agree with you. Yes, I agree. By the way, I think we're going to have to do that.
I agree.
But Eileen, you're thinking that that's going to have to happen soon. That'll probably.
It could happen. I mean, we could ask maybe the person at the, you know, Maryland Municipal League, could they guide us in terms of taking all these ideas and organizing them? You know, do they do that sort of thing? If they do it and it costs money, then we go to the city and ask them for money.
A question, is somebody from the city here with us today? Are we allowed to like have an executive session? Not to not have the public around, but to be able to do something that's like this, where got to spend some time.
I would have to check with the Office of Law when I go in tomorrow. I'm not sure about that.
It may not be of any benefit, but it just seems to me that, you know, this might be a way for us to have a meeting.
So you mean like a closed session?
Exactly.
Yeah, I'll check with Mr. Lyles tomorrow when I go into the office.
Thanks very much.
I mean, I'd be willing to to contact the Maryland Municipal League and find out what resources they might have for us.
Okay. I thought earlier in this meeting, of course, you would know if you're taking the notes, that we were going to use a contact. We at least raised the point that Minor might have had a direct contact. No?
I don't know, but I don't think that really, I mean, I can check with Minor and see if he has somebody specific, but I think whoever's the person in there now will just contact.
Okay,
I
fine.
mentioned Minor's name, so,
Yeah.
but I'll touch base with Minor.
Okay, very good, thanks. Hearing no further comments, can we move on in our discussion section, and hopefully we'll quickly go through this. Article 2, Rob and Paul on elections. Anything?
Yeah, so we met with Eileen on May 27th to talk with her about the both the charter part of the elections, Article 2, and its associated code. I would encourage everyone, I'm not going to go over our entire report, but I would encourage everyone to review our report and let us know if you have any questions about anything that we do not discuss here tonight. So basically, I'm going to cover a couple of things specifically related to the Board of Elections and the election code itself. And one of those is the primary, one of the things we talked about that we're working on, going to bring eventually to the commission, is the fact that our election code is currently not in sync with how the County Board of Elections administers our elections. For those of you who are not familiar, starting, I believe it was in 2017, the County Board of Elections was responsible for administering our elections. As a result, they have a different set of processes that do not necessarily align with what's in our election code. And so, we talked with Eileen about that, and that's one of the things that we want to bring to the commission to possibly consider in the future for including in our final report, is an encouragement for the city to update its election code so it meets with what the current process is for the county / city, the county / state. The other aspect, now that was related to the code, the other one of the things we talked about with Eileen related to the charter was the composition, the makeup of the Board of Elections itself. Right now, the Board of Elections is only 3 people. We talked about the idea of expanding it to 5, and also just talked briefly about how those 5 or maybe those 2 additional people would be selected in terms of their party affiliation and things of that nature. There was something else about the Board of Elections. No, I guess that was it. Those the 2 big ones for the Board of Elections was expanding it to 5, and then also how we would choose those extra individuals, specify that. So that would be a change to the charter. We also discussed some kind of what I would call bigger picture issues that Paul's going to.
Any questions for Rob on that? Okay. Yeah, we did talk about some very big picture issues because that's what we do. We looked at the idea of nonpartisan elections, which, as you probably know, was at least brought up in the last charter, by the last charter commission a decade ago, and maybe even before that. And it does come up too, just in general conversations at the city council level. So we looked at that, and we also looked at alternate voting options, such as ranked choice. That's one of several potential options that would require, if we were to make a recommendation, certainly would require a change to the charter. Our thought in earlier conversations was that it might be a really good idea to bring both of these to the commission for your consideration and present sort of a pro and con approach and see what you thought and get your views on that. But and Rob, jump in if I mischaracterize anything here, but I think it was our sense after discussing this at some length that doing either one of those at this point in time would be a huge deal. There would be significant consequential changes that would have to be made to the charter. I mean, significant, like multiple paragraphs, if not more. It would also have a deep impact on party structures and all that. You guys are aware of that. So the more we talked, I think we got a sense that maybe the real issue is how to expand opportunities for independents and nonpartisan candidates to access the ballot, to take part in elections, and how to improve sort of the opportunity for more individuals in our city to vote and to participate in elections. And while I can't say that we're going to bring you tonight any specific recommendations on that, I think that's sort of where we ended up, Rob. Is that fair characterization? And that would be our approach. I think that huge nonpartisan alternate voting change might be a little too much to chew on right now, and would better be the subject for something more comprehensive. So that's the direction I think we're running in. Rob, you want to add anything to that?
Nope. I mean, that's where we're at right now. I think, like I said, I would encourage you all to review the report and let us know if you have, any questions about any of the other items that we, that we talked about with Eileen and in that memo that Paul had written up and submitted. So
I guess I would say, I forgot to say, Rob, I apologize. It's, we don't have the right not to have you look at these issues if you feel like it. So I don't mean to say we're cutting off all discussion. It's just the two of us felt that these were massive and would require an enormous amount of work that we would maybe not have time for. But if the commission wishes to move in that direction, that's why you're here. So.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, obviously, I don't know how much folks have been following like letters to the editor in the Capitol, but specifically the nonpartisan issue has definitely starting to become a campaign issue now. And so I don't know how much of that sort of is how people feel about that and kind of the impact that our work will have, on a campaign. It's on the upcoming campaign. The irony here is it looks like the issue of nonpartisan elections is becoming a partisan political issue. So, and how much we as a commission want to wade in to something like that when it gets to that sort of level, so to speak. So.
Any other comments? Okay, moving to Article 3, which are powers. Ron and I put something together, and actually I sent you, Ron, and what we really do need, I guess, is to get that posted, if you will. But this was essentially the thoughts that we had last, I guess it was 2 weeks ago,
Right.
2 weeks ago, and trying to capture them. Since then, and Ron and I haven't had an opportunity to chat about this, I've spent a fair amount of time actually looking specifically at the power, which is Article 3, but at the powers section, not so much in terms of a rewrite or a rework of that particular section, but what would be the big issues that we want to look at as we started to go through this. Now, I haven't had the opportunity to share this with Ron. I was going to do it this afternoon, but other things actually cropped up and prevented me from doing that. But I think what's important when we look at the powers is to start to take some of the comments that Paul had from his discussion with Mike Lyles today, which is things like amendments, things like governance. When I say governance, I mean in the very broadest sense. What's the relationship between the mayor and the council? So it kind of look at what's the job of the mayor. And when I say job, I don't mean a job description. I mean, what's his role? They're kind of two things you look at. One is you empower somebody to do something, but the second thing is you give them the authority to do something. And we also have the issue with the city manager. So it's to really start taking a very careful look at the broader governance model that is sitting in there. And this is why I made that comment about 5-10 minutes ago, was when you start to look at how the existing Article 3 is designed, for me, it's just clumsy. It's not well crafted, because it starts to take on a whole new role in terms of, what's the responsibility in terms of providing water or providing sewer. Or we joke about the comment about bread, because bread is, of course, in Article 3. But there's also a whole set of other things in that very long paragraph in Article 3. I would hope that the discussion that Ron and I have, and then what we can ultimately share with you, will talk more about how should that Article 3, how should the powers be structured, and how should it be guiding those that have to run the city, manage the city. Not sure, Ron, whether you want to actually add any further thoughts to that.
No, my only thought is that and I've expressed this before, is that sometimes, particularly in that part about enumeration of what the city can do, is when you make a long list of things, there's no offense to any lawyer on the call, but some lawyer's going to say, well, you didn't say the city can do this. So I think, in terms of a rewrite, and forget about the arcane language and that kind of stuff, is just to maybe organize it in such a manner that it allows it doesn't, it's not exclusive of things that the city needs to do, because right now there's so many things that it identifies specifically that it begs the question, well, you didn't say this, so I guess I can do it. Or the city you didn't say this, so I guess you can't do it. So I think that's my only perspective on that, is maybe a more thoughtful presentation of city powers.
Any comments? Any thoughts on Article 3? And Eileen, as mentioned, we'll get that copy, which apparently was not posted on the drive. We'll get that to you, just so at least you've got something that was our first report. And what we're talking about right now would be the second report. Okay, moving to Article 4, which is the city council and the mayor. Right? Actually, it's 4 and 5. Sorry. So this would be Eileen and Minor.
Okay, well, Minor and I met earlier in May and had a couple of comments. And then Teresa Sutherland had put together some comments. And so I have a report that I'll post that brings in some of that and some other things that have come up in terms of talking like with the mayor. I think, as in many sections, there's a need for definitions, wordsmithing, and grammatical changes that would increase the clarity and the increased ease of reading the charter as a whole, but also in these two sections. In one, I noticed in article for city council, I would like to make it gender neutral, since the mayor keeps being identified as a he. But that also goes for the whole charter. Define quorum. Is it a simple majority or is it a supermajority? That kind of goes into some of the other areas that we've been talking about. It's not defined. In section 2A, on limitation on the conduct of alderpersons, that could use some clarification. It talks about their interactions with the city employees, but it's not very specific. It says they can't direct them, but does that mean they can communicate their wishes? I mean, that could probably use a little bit of clarification. There's some other things that need to be brought in line with other areas of this section going into Article 1 that I won't get into. Again, talk about the communication lines with the city council. Is it through the mayor, around the mayor? Do you go through the city manager? This is in relation to city employees, particularly directors. What is the legislative procedure in the charter? There's nothing, now it may be in the code, I didn't look there, but there's no real procedure as far as how they conduct their business. Another question that's come up is term limits for the city council. There's term limits for the mayor, but not for the city council. In regards to Article 5 with the mayor, we've talked a little bit before about it being a weak governance model, but there also seems to be some variation in how it's looked. Is he supposed to be the CEO, or is he supposed to just be a member of the city council? So how are those powers really aligned? Under acting mayor, it talks about defining temporary disability or absence, but I'm sorry, it talks about temporary disability and or absence. And it has a very elaborate list of who's next up if somebody's, not available, but it doesn't talk about defined temporary or defined disability. This goes towards, would there be a situation maybe where the mayor is not able to continue? So there's no talk about how do you deal with a mayor? And I guess the same could be said for aldermen or alderwomen if there's a problem with removal or need to remove. It doesn't identify direct reports such as the city manager and other titles. For instance, we have a deputy mayor now. I don't see anything, and it was, I guess, a resolution that was added, but there's nothing in the charter about a deputy mayor, which we now have. We also have an assistant city manager. The Office of Law, there were some questions about clarifying that the mayor appoints the city attorney, the council confirms it. And going to your point, Andy, a couple of weeks ago, when you used the term may, it says the mayor may remove the city attorney, as opposed to maybe should the mayor be the only one that removes the city attorney. That also brings up the whole concept, should the Office of Law even be in the charter in this way, because other areas aren't. The other thing under Office of Law that was identified was, it says the city attorney shall maintain a private practice except to the extent authorized by the city council by resolution. And I don't know if there is a resolution in the code. I don't know if Jacqueline's on this call, if she knows if that's there, but I think that speaks also just, again, to the vagueness that occurs in the code and the charter and the difficulty then in terms of actually doing oversight. So those are my comments. I'll put them on and I'll see if I can get some more for you.
Thank you. Any comments? Yes, Takia.
Sorry. The deputy city manager, that was a new position that was added last year. And so the charter, it's actually CA 120. If you wanted to look at that.
So how come it's not listed? This is for the assistant city manager?
No, for the deputy city manager.
Deputy. So, but it's not, I didn't see it in the charter that's posted.
Should have already been added because, like I said, it was last year. I'm not sure how often it's updated, but I can send you all that that charter if you'd like.
Right. Well, I'm making an assumption that when I'm looking at the charter that's posted online on the city website, that it's up to date with all the charter amendments that as they are as they're approved.
Yeah, it was approved. I'm going to send it to the group.
All right. Well, can you also check and see if there's other charter amendments that aren't posted on that we're not looking at? I mean, we should be able to see all of the charter amendments.
Sure. Because this was September 14th, 2020.
Okay. All right, I'll take a look again and see if I find it, but again, I didn't see it, so it just begs the question, are there other charter amendments that need to be added? So we can look at that. So that's the end of my report.
Good, thank you. Any comments? Hearing none, we'll move on to Article
Just a
6.
question. Are you going to make, Eileen, are you going to make, well, actually, it's a great place to ask the question. How does one proceed from here? So you've made, let's just say, 10 really interesting suggestions. What happens now? Is it your responsibility or your committee's responsibility to actually break up, put this into a formal proposal for the commission to consider, or have we haven't really thought about that? How does this work now?
Well, I think that's kind of what I've been trying to ask. I don't feel, I'm not a professional in this area. I can cull information, I can analyze information. And this is where I think we need to have assistance from a professional saying, what is the next step? How do we pull all these ideas together? What can we realistically do and not do? So again, it goes back to whether it's a preamble or it's code. Who's going to write it? I don't see us writing necessarily. We're making recommendations. but what is the next step? And that may be, again, a different type of commission or a different type of committee that's formed to draw up either all the amendments or go with the restructuring.
Any thoughts? Any thoughts elsewhere on, because this is an important question. This is kind of the next step after.
Well, it seems to me like a reasonable step open for debate is, I mean, what I would love to see happen is that, and we'll just pick on Eileen because it's fun right now.
I'm the girl. No,
She just made this last report. Basically what she just said is a series of recommendations, and they can be stated in bullet point form. Basically, in principle, we believe that the following should occur. And then I would see this going to Jacqueline and say, is this right, wrong? Are we completely insane, partially insane? Where do we stand here? And then get that answer back, and we can either dispose of the proposal at that point in time or continue forward with it. Because in the end, that's more or less how our recommendations are going to be made anyway. They're not going to be in legislative text.
Paul, at the risk of stretching this, and it's an important point we really do need to resolve, but at the risk of stretching it out, this will occur 8 times. I mean, we have 8 separate groups that are looking at all this. So it's not just, this is what Eileen's talking about times 8, which is
Isn't that what we're doing?
So I'm not so sure that the process ought to go through Jacqueline to see what gets written, as much as maybe we should be looking at an approach to how we're going to eventually articulate each of these 8 things. You see what I'm sort of driving at? Is that, the issue is that if we have to push every single one of these 8 through this knothole of what does it look like, or how will it, is this okay? What are we going to get at the end of this? Are we going to get somebody that really can do that, and they give us something back that is workable? Because I see at the end of all this, if we look at the 2 deliverables, number 1 is a report mid-July, which I see probably as a bullet pointed 8-pager, but I do see the final report as something substantially more consequential. And I would think that this one thing is going to be a contribution to that end report. And I'm not.
So I definitely think it resonates on me that there's 8 different articles. We're going to get a lot of recommendations. Is it possible that one of our primary recommendations, I don't know if we would categorize them, but one of the primary recommendations is to, I don't know, formalize or extend this process. Not saying that we all would be on it on the next phase, but to truly say, based on all the evaluation analysis by this commission and all the outreach that we perform, et cetera, it's clear that the city charter needs a major revamp. And our recommendation is to engage, with, to your point, Eileen, some professionals, and maybe a consultant from the municipal league to truly, take the time to propose a draft that stands on its own and isn't always being poked at every 10 years by various citizens about bread and lack of vision and things like that. It's just a thought.
Yeah.
The thought again being, this needs to go beyond September 15th, I guess.
Oh, and I think it will, at least, based on my understanding of if there's interest. We'll learn more about this over the next month. whether it's got legs and traction beyond the 15th of September. In other words, will the council actually enact and do
Exactly.
something with it?
The new council, right?
It could be, yeah, it more than likely will be the new one. But let's go back to, I guess it's really Paul's point, which is, what do we do with this? You know, Eileen's got 10 good recommendations, and we're going to have this potentially times 8. And what do we do once we get these 10 recommendations? Maybe I'm thinking in the wrong time frame. I'm thinking in the short term. I'm not thinking September. I'm thinking of really the next month, or maybe the next 6 weeks. What are we going to do with those 10? And maybe if we can solve the issue of what we're going to do with Eileen's 10, then we can figure out the other 7, what we're going to do. We'll just use the same approach that we're going to do with 10. So I guess the core question is, what ought we be doing? I don't know, Paul. I want to toss this ball back in your court. It's just that because you raised the point of where do we go from here? How do we get those 10 good ideas into a workable form?
Ben had his hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yep.
Let me try to untangle it. For
Good.
purposes of July 15, whatever bullet point recommendations this commission comes up with per article is at best can only reflect our reviews of those articles. They're not going to have much input from professionals, if you will. We're not going to have many presentations. So to me, the bullet pointed what you're calling recommendations, Andy, could almost be a exhibit to the July 15th document. And I think that the July 15th document should be a summary of our interaction with the stakeholders and the community groups based on the core questions. Put in some type of matrix form that this commission can say, here are the apples that compare to the apples, the oranges that compare to the oranges, and we see a pattern here. I understand your point, Jeff, about the diversity of opinion that's out there, but the task at hand would be for us to find some commonality in that. And so the July 15th document would be, here's our feedback based on our interaction with the community and the stakeholders, and here are exhibits based on our initial take, our own commission review of the articles of the charter. Then from July 15th to September, Andy, I think you have a lot more space to hone in, kind of like what Jeff was saying, on our own review, bring in some professionals, really hash it out. Yes, there's 10 things that Eileen listed, but do they mesh with what we learned when we discussed with stakeholders in the community? And of the 10, what's feasible? And that's what happens by September. You see what I mean?
I do.
I think that gets you out of that stuckness, that you're trying to raise.
Let me just at least cover the process. Eileen's got the 10.
Mm-hmm.
And what's the next thing we do with her 10? What's the next thing she does with her 10?
Bullet point it, and let's build an exhibit for
articulate.
the 15th document.
Okay.
The exhibits would be initial commentary by commission members on the various articles of the charter.
Okay. So if I could just recast Ben's idea, what we're going to do is between now and July 15th, will be relatively siloed. It will be, we have a series of teams, if you will, looking at something, they will report out. Once we get past that, we'll not only have the feedback from the council, but then we start to actually mesh and harmonize those of what's realistic, what's going to work, to whatever the ultimate recommendation is going to be. So there's really kind of a double step that we're going on. Did I characterize that accurately?
Well, the good news is punts till after July 15th, what I think will be the very time consuming portion of this, which is, what is the feasibility and appropriate place of the various recommendations that we're discussing. So you're not going to get there before July 15th, but you could get there by September.
Okay.
Can I amend? Oh, go ahead, Ben. I apologize.
No, I just can't hear. That's all.
It's because you're not in a bar.
Right.
Can I amend your point, Ben, slightly?
Sure.
Would there be any reason why, and this all assumes, let's just say tomorrow Eileen comes up and she says, here's your 10 bullet points, beautifully phrased, ready to go, as it were, for consideration. It's obviously just a committee report given, and the commission hasn't voted on it, a given. But it will comprise, as Ben has said, a part of our report, 1 of 8 or whatever the number is, on July 15th. Couldn't we also get started with the process of asking the professionals along the way? I mean, why couldn't we ask Jacqueline, here's 10 beautifully phrased things.
Oh, sure.
What do you think?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay,
I was trying to address Andy's concern about the timing of it all.
Got it. Okay.
Absolutely.
What do you think, Eileen?
There's no reason not to reach out and get feedback,
I mean, I think before we get to the point in terms of talking to Jacqueline as far as putting that into play, I think we have to decide, is that the direction we think we ought to go? I think we'll have more information if we hear from a lot of the stakeholders. We're talking about, governance. What type of governance? Are we saying we think the governance that's currently in place is a good one, or we suggest another one? Are we going to say we think it should go to a city manager model? So I don't think we're quite there. I think we're still looking at options. It's asking the question, is this the governance that we want? And looking at options. So I think I like Ben's thoughts in terms of just creating some bullet points, because I think that helps to communicate to the city council, these are the questions, these are the areas maybe of weakness or opportunity that we're identifying, and then we can get feedback from them also. So I think that's helpful to me in terms of how we're going to approach the work session and the document that we give them. And I think every section already has some of that in place.
I believe that's true. I think if we actually compiled the notes already taken, we'd have a fair amount of bullet points per section, per article, rather.
Okay, any other comments? I'm keeping my eye on the clock. I know it's getting late now. Any other comments on this while we're here? Let me move. I actually lost track. I think we were at Article 6, operations. No, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think we're on 6.
Do we have finances yet?
No, finance.
7 is
This is 7. Finance is Jeff and myself.
finance is 7, which I'm happy. Can I just touch on operations quickly, and you can get to 7? We already have points on the shared document for Article 6, and I think a lot of them came from Paul. So those are already out there, and I'd propose to just put them in the same type of bullet point form that we were just discussing with Eileen. But Paul and I did have a call, if you don't mind speaking for us, Paul, if you don't mind if I speak for us. And the one thing that's not on the shared document that we did discuss that is specific to this commission is a very simple mandate that the next commission, if there is one, represent 5 out of the 7 wards. I know that's a very specific comment, but I think it speaks to the underlying nature of this entire commission this year. So in addition to the notes that are on the shared document, a recommendation that this commission also be overhauled to be more representative of the city.
Yeah, at least 5 of 7. I think if Ben and I had our way, it'd be all 8. But we thought maybe that would tie somebody's hands. It might not happen. So
I'm sorry, did I say 5 of 7? I meant 5 of 8. I'm sorry.
I think you did, yeah.
I'm not going to say which word I forgot.
Okay, moving smartly on to Article 7, which is finance. Jeff, okay if I just go through the.
Yeah. Yeah, I would
Okay.
just clarify that our document is up on the group drive. It's already been staged there, and it's available for everybody to review.
Great. Okay. Just the highlights, if I could just go through some of the main structural points we talked about. What we tried to do is divide it between what we'll call goals of what, and this is trying to stay away from a very precise articulation of revisions. Now, both of us, and probably you others have, we've actually read Teresa Sutherland's 15-page report. Her report is quite valuable, with probably one strong exception. It's very, very precise. It goes through almost on a word-by-word basis of what the revision should be. And actually what Jeff and I talked about earlier today was that politically, something like that would be very difficult to actually get through. And it goes back to really what we've said in so many of these meetings, is we're not going to be that granular in terms of our ideas. So really divided our report into two parts. One is goals, and the other is high-level thoughts that we'd like to accomplish. On the goals side of it, one of the things we're going to talk about, or one of the things we think needs to happen, is to improve the structure of the chapter, just in terms of clarity, have a better understanding of the limitations and the responsibilities and the authorities, who it rests with. It's actually quite ambiguous in certain parts. And when you look at finance, oftentimes one of the things about clarity is when can certain things be exceeded. So for example, if you have a budget exception, if somebody needs to spend more money, who can authorize that? And it's not terribly clear with that. I think the second thing that came to mind quickly was that we were really trying to avoid, can't do it because we don't have the money. When you have a multi-million-dollar budget, that, and for someone who has actually worked inside a government, that falls on very, very deaf ears. I mean, that's just bad management. I mean, if somebody says, can't do it because I don't have the money, there's something structurally wrong with the way you're approving or not approving certain things. This is a very important thing that Jeff has raised several occasions, and that is to balance revenues with expenditures, i.e. the balanced budget. A third thing is, or excuse me, a fourth thing that we looked at in terms of the goal was, find a way to create surplus. And this may get back, believe it or not, to governance. I think an awful lot of political experience that I've had over the decades has, to the extent you have, and it usually happens in Western cultures, to the extent you have politicians involved with expenditures on budgets, you will never have a surplus. It just doesn't work because the politician will always find a way to spend money. And they'll spend it sometimes on a self-driven interest that they have. So it's not in the best interest of the city, but that would be a goal, to actually try to promote a surplus that actually exists in the budgeting process. And then also a final goal would be to try to look at what the borrowing capacity of the city is. In other words, trying to take a look at the fiduciary, what I'll call the fiduciary health of the city. Does it have an exemplary credit rating? And if it doesn't, why not? Why shouldn't it have a AAA borrowing rating? And I don't even know what their borrowing rating is, but we'll find out when we have discussions with the finance person. On a high level, we looked at, as I said, clarity for the debt vehicles that the city takes on. They talked about borrowing capacity, and it's a little murky in terms of what it is. And in some cases, it's quite detailed. Something that's near and dear to my heart is limitations on asset sales. And I mentioned this in the last meeting. Try to avoid a situation where the politicians are trying to sell an asset to cover an operating expense. And of course, in the world of finance, you never, ever do that. You never sell a capital asset to cover an operational expense. And it's just, I mean, that's sloppy budgeting. But there's no guardrail that's sitting in the budgeting process, or at least in the charter, to prevent that. So you could actually have a council that wants to make ends meet at the end of the year, and they wind up selling a building or a house or whatever it happens to be. The final thing was to, and this is going to be an interesting one, but to remove the outdated and ambiguous language. Not specifically, the recommendation just may be that, just to go in and find that outdated language that is sitting in there. A lot of them, and I'm surprised at this, because they're very specific spending limits. And, you know, in any kind of an economy where you have inflation, you know, the spending that hurts the person who's got the spending limit, because, you know, inflation is going to change the way people spend. So I'm a bit surprised that those kinds of absolute values are sitting in a document like this. I guess the thinking is that at some point in time, you know, if the spending limit needs to be increased, you just modify the charter and you just increase the spending limit. But it's you know, it's not really a clever way to put it together. So those are the, as I said, the first set were the goals, and the second really were more additional thoughts that we have. And we'll dig into this a lot deeper than that. Any questions that we can answer? Not hearing any. Can we go to the seventh one, which is Article 8, which is personnel, which is Ben and Paul, and Article 9 too, which is miscellaneous.
Paul, how do you want to? I mean, I have my notes here. Do you want
That
to?
would be fabulous if you have your notes in front of you. I don't have
So
mine.
again, Paul and I sent notes from our meeting on 8 and 9 to Eileen. I've not checked, so I'm guilty, but I assume they're posted because Eileen, you told me they are. So they are there. But just to tie in general concepts that we've discussed at this meeting with our review of 8 and 9, I think when we were talking about Attorney Lyle's comments about lines of authority, about the empowerment of officers, and about processes, the rulemaking process. A lot of those concepts sort of flowed in our conversation, specifically in Article 8. You'll see those in our comments. So Section 2, there's an exclusion in that section for directors, but not for newer directors that had been created. For example, the deputy director of the environment. We had questions on who's responsible to who, if you will. On the finance side, there's language in there about the retirement system. We thought it would be helpful to have a conversation with the city on the current status of it versus legacy. So the article as it relates to structure, I think, and empowerment is what you'll see in our comments. With Article 9, our comments were more, I'd say, aspirational in nature, more forward thinking. And again, remember, Article 9 is miscellaneous, so it's already, you know, vague to begin with. But for instance, Section 6, Article 9 is how the code is codified. There's no reference to electronic format. Clearly, in today's day and age, there should be at least some reference to how additions to the code are housed electronically and available electronically. Section 9, Paul brought up the law office and how the language in Section 9, which I think has to do with the liability of the city, has been litigated over the years. This is an effective section. And then the last thing Paul brought up again is a general statement, but I think it encompasses parts of 8 and 9 and totally ties into discussions today about lines of authority. which is a review of the Office of Law's responsibility to the City Council in addition to the mayor. To paraphrase what you said, Paul, but correct me if I'm wrong, is that the Office of Law may or may not be more of the mayor's resource than it is the city's resource. And to clarify that. So.
Perfect.
Yeah,
That's what I do.
good job. Interesting point. Any comments?
Quick question. Your Article 8 is the personnel, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Did you all talk about or the specifically about like pension issues? Because I know that like the city runs a different pension system, I think, for the police and fire than they do for the other staff.
Yes, that's the comment about legacy versus current.
Gotcha. Okay.
I'm not an I mean, I know pensions, but I'm not an authority on the city's pensions. But where we left off was it absolutely would be worthwhile to speak with someone about legacy systems versus current status of the pension system. There's also a spouse's pension in Section 6. We spoke briefly about whether that still exists. I don't think it's very a huge issue, but it's, you know, there's language of legacy systems and current systems, and we wanted to get a feel for the status of the one and the ongoing burden of the other. Legacy pension systems tend to be more expensive than current pension systems. I know that as a general concept. So,
Any other comments? Okay, the last of the 8 is what's missing. Lawrence.
I think when I first reported this last meeting, I had about 5 issues. The one I think is most important is the one regarding the cybersecurity. Based upon the issues that we now read about in our news papers and reports from various journalists, we need to ensure that our city does have a plan of how to protect the city's resources, whatever they may be, the waters, supply, electricity, and such. And if these are compromised, what does the city do? Do we pay the ransom? Do we ignore them and let folks suffer? Or is there a plan of any type? So to me, based upon some of the other things that I brought up on board, I think this is one that we need to pay a lot of attention to at this point in our history. Usually, that type of issue would reside with the emergency management director, who happens to be the deputy fire chief. So we might like to address that as an issue that this commission is concerned with.
Comments?
I'd say that this idea of cybersecurity and emergency management is probably one of the most emerging concepts during this commission's tenure. I have to say, when you brought it up, Lawrence, 2 weeks ago, I think, at that time we had only had one gas pipeline hack. We can't buy beef, and God knows what's going to be hit next. So it's an interesting concept. I mean, it is on the cusp, and certainly a city's ability to clearly define the powers that exist for emergency management. I got to say, I think it's on the table. So,
what I didn't do, I just thought about a few days ago, was to maybe try to get a meeting with the deputy fire chief. Maybe I can get some answers there may be some things that we don't know about that are in the works, but an update at least would be beneficial to us, I believe.
You're on mute, Eileen.
Sorry. Lawrence, isn't, you're talking about the deputy fire chief, but there's an independent Office of Emergency Management now that has Director Simmons. So there is a separate group in the city. Is that what you're referring to, or?
Well, I thought Director's Chief Simmons, I think is his name.
Right, he's now the director of the Office of Emergency
Yeah,
Management. So I
yeah.
believe it's a whole separate, it's a whole separate department now. So it's,
Yeah, you're correct. That's true.
okay.
Yeah.
So it's not part of the fire department.
No.
Okay.
He has an office right there in the Gorman Street,
Right.
where he is, and that's what he does most of the time.
Okay, so emergency powers and emergency process seems to be one of the overriding types of things that falls into all of the sections. And so I'm wondering if it would be beneficial to add Director Simmons to the list of people to talk to.
And
Because
ask
it
him-
impacts elections, it talks about, when I talk about temporary disability, I mean,
Right, but ask him the core questions that we devised. that you can-
I totally agree. Yeah, but I think that might be worthwhile to add him.
That would be very interesting.
And we can ask him, where's the beef, right?
Right.
Yeah, right.
We don't have.
Where's the bunker?
Yeah, don't mess with the beef, right?
Right.
Andy, that's all I have. There were some other issues. I didn't think they were paramount at this point. I'll talk about the issue with identifying the schools. And I think I talked about some of the issues we had with defining the annexation process and things like that. I think what I recall. So, that's all I have.
Thank you. Questions, comments? Okay. Final wrap up. Anything that was not on the agenda that somebody would like to raise? Not hearing any. Do I hear a motion to adjourn?
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you very much.